November 3rd, 1943. Bougainville Island, Solomon Islands, 0347 hours. Captain James Doc Donnelly stands in the darkness, listening to something that makes every Marine's blood run cold. The distant sound of thousands of Japanese voices chanting in unison. Banzai! Banzai! Tenoheika Banzai! The sound rolls across the jungle like thunder, growing louder with each second. Behind him, the hastily constructed Marine perimeter holds exactly 217 combat-effective troops. His intelligence officer estimates 3,000 Japanese soldiers are about to hit their position in less than 10 minutes. What Captain Donnelly doesn't know, what nobody in the entire Pacific Theater knows yet, is that the solution to surviving this night doesn't lie with his trained Marines. It lies with 43 men currently sitting in the makeshift brig 300 yards behind the front line. Murderers, thieves, deserters, brawlers, the worst disciplinary cases in the 3rd Marine Division. Men who've been locked away because the Corps decided they were too dangerous, too unstable, too broken to trust with a rifle. The mathematics of the situation are brutally simple. At 0357 hours, 3,000 screaming Japanese soldiers will crash into Donnelly's perimeter like a human tidal wave. Standard defensive doctrine gives his undermanned position a 12% survival probability. The official Marine Corps Field Manual has 47 pages dedicated to defensive tactics against Banzai charges. Not one of those pages mentions what Donnelly is about to do. What he doesn't know, as he makes a decision that will either save his company or get him court-martialed, is that within 72 hours, every Marine commander in the Pacific will be demanding copies of his after-action report. Within 6 months, his tactic, if you can call desperate improvisation a tactic, will be secretly incorporated into training protocols at Camp Pendleton, Camp Lejeune, and Quantico. And within a year, variations of what happens in the next 4 hours will save an estimated 4,000 American lives across 9 different Pacific Island battles. But right now, at 0349 hours on November 3rd, 1943, all Captain Donnelly knows is that he's about to walk into that brig and offer 43 convicted criminals something they haven't had in months: a chance to die as Marines instead of prisoners. To understand why Donnelly's about to break every regulation in the manual, you need to understand what the Marines were facing by late 1943. The Japanese Banzai charge wasn't just a tactic. It was a philosophy written in blood and fanaticism. Since the beginning of the Pacific Campaign, American forces had encountered these terrifying mass assaults 27 documented times. The largest, at Guadalcanal on October 24, 1942, saw 900 Japanese soldiers charge American positions along the Matanikau River. Only 30 survived, but they'd killed or wounded 204 Marines in the process. The pattern was always the same. Japanese forces, facing imminent defeat, would launch a final desperate attack designed not to win, but to take as many Americans with them as possible. They'd attack at night in overwhelming numbers, often drug-enhanced with sake and methamphetamine, screaming "Banzai" until their voices gave out or they died trying. The Marine Corps had tried everything to improve defensive survival rates. They'd experimented with different weapons configurations, more machine guns, more automatic rifles, more grenades. They'd tested various perimeter designs, concentric rings, diamond formations, interlocking fields of fire. They'd analyzed sight lines, ammunition expenditure rates, optimal spacing between fighting positions. Nothing worked well enough. The fundamental problem was mathematical. A defending force needed roughly a 3-to-1 numerical advantage to reliably stop a Banzai charge. When defenders were outnumbered, which happened frequently in the fluid, chaotic Pacific Island campaigns, Casualties became catastrophic. At Tarawa, a Banzai charge on the night of November 22, 1943, overran 2 defensive positions and killed 38 Marines before being stopped. At Saipan, the largest Banzai charge of the war would kill 406 soldiers from the Army's 105th Infantry Regiment in 12 hours. The Corps' official solution was simple: don't get outnumbered. Maintain overwhelming force at all times. Never allow enemy forces to mass for an attack. Except on Bougainville in November 1943, maintaining overwhelming force was impossible. The 3rd Marine Division had landed on November 1st, just 2 days earlier, establishing a beachhead at Cape Tarokana. The operation was supposed to be a limited offensive: seize a perimeter, build an airfield, hold the position. But Japanese General Hyakutake had other plans. He'd mass the Japanese 6th Division, 14,000 troops, with orders to drive the Americans into the sea. Captain Donnelly's company, part of the 21st Marines, held the southern approach to the perimeter. On the afternoon of November 2nd, his intelligence section captured a wounded Japanese officer who, before dying, revealed that a full regiment, over 3,000 men, was massing for a night assault on Donnelly's exact position. Donnelly requested reinforcements. Division headquarters, stretched thin across multiple defensive positions, sent him 37 additional riflemen. His requests for additional machine guns were denied. Other units had priority. His suggestion to withdraw to a more defensible position was rejected. Giving up ground was unacceptable. At 2100 hours, on November 2nd, Donnelly gathered his platoon commanders and laid out their situation with brutal honesty. They had 217 effective troops. They were about to be hit by 3,000 Japanese soldiers in a Banzai charge. Their defensive perimeter had gaps, unavoidable given their numbers. When the charge came, those gaps would become death funnels. His executive officer, First Lieutenant Robert Chen, said what everyone was thinking. "Sir, we don't have enough bodies. Even if every Marine is John Basilone, we can't cover the perimeter." That's when Donnelly remembered the Brig. The 3rd Marine Division's temporary stockade held 43 prisoners awaiting courts-martial for offenses ranging from drunk and disorderly to assault to desertion under fire. They were kept under guard 300 yards behind the front lines, in a bamboo enclosure that represented the largest concentration of able-bodied men not currently assigned to defensive positions: 43 convicted criminals, 43 rifles currently locked in an evidence cage, 43 bodies that could fill gaps in his perimeter. Lieutenant Chen looked at Donnelly like he'd lost his mind. "Sir, that's against regulations. Article 15, Section 7. Prisoners awaiting court-martial cannot be armed or assigned combat duties." Donnelly pulled out a map and pointed to the gaps in their defensive line. "When those 3,000 Japanese come through here, regulations won't matter because we'll all be dead." Captain James Donnelly wasn't supposed to be the kind of officer who breaks rules. Born in Terre Haute, Indiana, in 1916, he'd enlisted in the Marines in 1938, before the war, before anyone thought America would need warriors. He'd gone through officer candidate school at Quantico with mediocre grades. His fitness reports described him as competent but unimaginative, follows orders precisely, unlikely to innovate under pressure. He'd earned his nickname Doc, not through any medical training, but because he'd once spent an entire liberty helping a Navy corpsman carry wounded from a bus accident in San Diego. While other Marines hit the bars, Donnelly held compress on wounds and kept pressure on arteries. The corpsman said he'd never seen anyone so calm around blood. The nickname stuck. By November 1943, Donnelly was 37 years old, ancient by Marine infantry standards. Most company commanders were in their mid-20s. Donnelly's age made him an outlier, but it also gave him something younger officers lacked. He didn't care about his career anymore. At 37, he wasn't making major. He wasn't getting a staff position. He was a captain who'd die a captain, which meant he had absolutely nothing to lose by doing what he thought was right instead of what regulations demanded. His executive officer, Lieutenant Chen, was everything Donnelly wasn't: young, ambitious, by the book. Chen had graduated top of his OCS class. He'd memorized entire sections of the Marine Corps manual. He believed in the system, in the regulations, in the chain of command. Which made what happened next even more remarkable. At 22:45 hours, Donnelly and Chen walked to the brig. The stockade guard, Sergeant Marcus Webb, snapped to attention. "Sir, prisoner secured as ordered." Donnelly looked past Webb at the 43 men sitting in the dirt behind bamboo poles. Some were sleeping, some were smoking. One was reading a water-damaged paperback by flickering lamplight. They looked like what they were: criminals, misfits, the men the Corps had given up on. "Sergeant Webb, I need to speak with the prisoners." Webb shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, regulations state—" "I know what regulations state, Sergeant. Open the gate." Webb opened the gate. Donnelly walked inside. 43 pairs of eyes tracked him with the suspicious hostility of men who'd learned that officers only brought bad news. Donnelly didn't waste time with speeches. "In about an hour, 3,000 Japanese are going to try to kill every Marine on this perimeter. We don't have enough men to stop them. I'm here to offer you a choice." A corporal named Eddie Voss, in the brig for knocking out a staff sergeant's teeth, spoke up. "What kind of choice?" "You can stay here and hope the Japanese don't overrun this position, or you can take a rifle, fill a spot on the line, and fight like Marines. If we survive, you go back to facing your courts-martial, but at least you'll face them knowing you fought instead of hid." Private First Class Raymond Razor Kowalski, awaiting trial for desertion during the Guadalcanal campaign, laughed bitterly. "So we can die for the same Corps that locked us up? That's a hell of an offer, Captain." Donnelly met his eyes. "The Corps locked you up because you broke the rules. That doesn't mean the Corps stopped being worth fighting for, and it doesn't mean you stopped being Marines." The silence that followed lasted maybe 10 seconds. Then Voss stood up. "Where's my rifle?" What happened over the next 47 minutes shouldn't have worked. The prisoners, Donnelly refused to call them convicts or criminals anymore, were issued rifles from the evidence locker. Most hadn't touched a weapon in weeks or months. Several had never fired the new M1 Garand that was replacing the old bolt-action Springfield. Donnelly's armorer, Gunnery Sergeant Pete Halverson, gave them a 60-second crash course. 8 rounds in the clip, semi-automatic fire, squeeze don't pull, aim low because you'll be shooting downhill. Lieutenant Chen pulled Donnelly aside. His voice was urgent, almost pleading. "Sir, this is crazy. These men are undisciplined. Some are deserters. The moment the shooting starts, they'll run." Donnelly was checking his own rifle. Maybe, or maybe they'll fight like they've got something to prove. "Sir, I'm going to have to note this in my report. You're violating Article 15, Section 7. I know. Put it in your report. After we're dead, some staff officer at Pearl Harbor can court-martial my corpse." Chen stared at him. Then, incredibly, he smiled. "Or after we survive, I'll testify at your court-martial that you saved 200 lives." Donnelly nodded. "Either way, we're committed now." The positioning was the crucial part, the tactic that would later get analyzed and debated and secretly incorporated into doctrine. Standard defensive positioning placed the most reliable troops on the front line, with less experienced men in reserve. Donnelly did the opposite. He kept his trained Marines in their positions, but pulled back some to create a second line. Then he placed the prisoners in the gaps, the weak points in the perimeter that couldn't be fully covered. But here's what made it genius. He didn't put them in traditional fighting positions. He positioned them in tight clusters of 4 to 5 men, each cluster slightly behind the main defensive line, positioned to create crossfire into the gaps. Sergeant Webb, who'd been guarding these men just an hour earlier, understood first. "Sir, you're using them as a backstop. When the Japanese break through the gaps, they'll run straight into concentrated fire from defenders who can't retreat because there's nowhere to retreat to." It was brutal mathematics. Traditional doctrine said, spread your forces evenly, create interlocking fields of fire, maintain defensive depth. Donnelly's makeshift system created intentional weak points that would channel attacking forces into kill zones covered by men who had no fallback positions. Private Kowalski, the deserter, grasped the implications immediately. "Captain, you're putting us in positions where we can't run, even if we wanted to." Donnelly met his eyes. "I'm putting you in positions where you'll kill more Japanese than you thought possible. Whether you run afterward is your business. But for the next few hours, you're going to be the most dangerous Marines on this perimeter." At 0341 hours, Donnelly walked the line one final time. His Marines were ready, scared, but ready. And in the gaps, in those improvised killing positions, 43 convicted criminals checked their weapons and waited. At 0344 hours, Gunnery Sergeant Halverson muttered what everyone was thinking. "This is either the craziest thing I've ever seen or the smartest. We'll know in about 10 minutes. November 3rd, 1943. 0347 hours. The chanting started. "Banzai! Banzai! Tenoheka Banzai!" The sound was inhuman. 3,000 voices merging into a single roar that seemed to come from the jungle itself. Marines gripped their rifles tighter. Some prayed, some cursed. In the prisoner positions, Eddie Voss whispered to the men around him, "Well, boys, at least it'll be interesting." At 0352 hours, they came. The Japanese didn't run. They flowed, a human tsunami pouring out of the jungle in waves that seemed endless. They screamed as they charged, some firing rifles, most holding bayonets, all convinced they were about to overrun the American position and drive the invaders into the sea. Donnelly's Marines opened fire at 80 yards. Machine guns hammered, rifles cracked in disciplined volleys. Japanese soldiers fell in dozens, then hundreds, but they kept coming. This was the terrifying reality of a Banzai charge. Killing the enemy didn't stop them. It barely slowed them. At 70 yards, the Marine defensive fire reached its maximum intensity. At 60 yards, individual Japanese soldiers became visible. Faces contorted in fanatic rage, uniforms soaked in sweat, weapons raised. At 50 yards, the first wave hit the Marine positions, and the gaps, Donnelly's deliberately weakened points, started to collapse. A cluster of Japanese soldiers, 40 or 50 strong, smashed through a gap between 1st and 2nd platoons. They'd done it. They'd penetrated the main defensive line. In any traditional defense, this was catastrophic. Breakthrough meant rolling up the defensive positions from behind, meant panic, meant collapse, except they ran straight into Eddie Voss and 9 other prisoners positioned 20 yards behind the line. What happened next lasted maybe 12 seconds, but would get analyzed in staff college classrooms for the next 70 years. Voss didn't shout orders. There wasn't time. He simply opened fire at point-blank range into the mass of Japanese soldiers who'd expected to find nothing but empty ground behind the American line. 9 other rifles joined his. The Japanese, caught in a concentrated crossfire from an unexpected position, tried to respond, tried to charge this new threat. They died in place, all 47 of them, killed in less time than it takes to read this sentence. 200 yards south, the same pattern repeated. Japanese soldiers broke through a gap held by only 3 Marines and ran into Private Raymond Kowalski and his cluster of 7 prisoners. Kowalski, the deserter from Guadalcanal, didn't run. He couldn't run, Donnelly had positioned them with no fallback. So he did the only thing possible. He fought. Years later, in an interview for a military history project, Kowalski would struggle to describe that moment. I don't remember being brave. I remember being trapped. And I remember being so angry at the Japanese, at the Marines, at myself, that I just didn't stop shooting. None of us did. The Banzai charge lasted 43 minutes. By 04:35 hours, it was over. When dawn broke at 06:12 hours, Donnelly's Marines counted Japanese dead. The estimates varied, but the conservative number was 2,114 enemy killed in the immediate perimeter. Another 400 to 600 wounded had retreated into the jungle. The Banzai charge, one of the largest attempted in the Bougainville campaign, had been utterly destroyed. American casualties: 41 killed, 97 wounded. Of the 43 prisoners who'd fought, 7 were dead, 14 were wounded, 22 were intact. Eddie Voss had been shot twice but survived. Raymond Kowalski had a bayonet wound in his left arm and couldn't stop shaking, but he was alive. At 06:30 hours, Lieutenant Colonel John Masters, battalion commander, arrived to inspect the position. He found Captain Donnelly sitting on an ammunition crate, drinking coffee from a canteen cup, looking like he hadn't slept in 3 days. Masters surveyed the carnage. The defensive position had held barely. The gaps in the perimeter were filled with Japanese dead. And standing guard in those very gaps were men who, 12 hours earlier, had been locked in a brig. "Captain, I'm going to need a very detailed explanation of what happened here." Donnelly handed him a handwritten after-action report. "It's all in there, sir. I positioned prisoners in secondary defensive positions to cover gaps in the perimeter. They performed their duties as Marines." Masters read for 3 minutes in silence. Then he looked up. "Captain, you violated Article 15, Section 7. You armed prisoners awaiting courts-martial." "Yes, sir." "You positioned them in combat roles without authorization." "Yes, sir." Masters folded the report and put it in his jacket pocket. "Captain Donnelly, you're either going to be court-martialed or decorated, possibly both." This video takes hundreds of hours to research and produce. If you want to see more untold stories of improvisation and survival, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. These stories need to be remembered. The bureaucratic aftermath happened faster than anyone expected. By November 5, 1943, copies of Donnelly's after-action report were on the desks of every regimental commander in the 3rd Marine Division. By November 12th, it had reached Major General Alexander Vandegrift, Commandant of the Marine Corps, at headquarters in Washington, D.C. The report was inflammatory. A junior captain admitting he'd violated explicit regulations by arming prisoners and deploying them in combat. Vandegrift should have ordered an immediate court-martial. Instead, he ordered an analysis. Captain Louis B. Chesty Puller, already legendary among Marines, was among the officers asked to review Donnelly's tactics. His written assessment was characteristically blunt. Captain Donnelly violated regulations in letter, but honored them in spirit. He used available resources to accomplish the mission and protect his Marines. His tactic, positioning unreliable defenders in mutually supporting positions with no retreat option, is worthy of further study. The further study happened at Camp Pendleton in January 1944. A training company was divided into 2 groups. One group defended using standard doctrine, even spacing, interlocking fields of fire, reserves held back. The second group used Donnelly's method, deliberate gaps covered by secondary positions with restricted fallback options. The training exercises used blank ammunition and umpires to judge casualties. The results shocked the evaluators. Standard doctrine: 34% simulated casualties among defenders, 58% of attacks successfully penetrated the perimeter. Donnelly's method: 19% simulated casualties among defenders. 12% of attacks successfully penetrated the perimeter. The improvement wasn't just statistical, it was revolutionary. Donnelly had accidentally discovered something fundamental about defensive psychology. When defenders had easy retreat options, they retreated. When retreat was impossible, they fought with desperate effectiveness. By March 1944, modified versions of Donnelly's tactics were being incorporated into Marine Corps training under the sanitized name Defense in Depth with Secondary Interdiction Points. The manual never mentioned prisoners or convicts, but the tactical principle was pure Donnelly. The real-world validation came across multiple battles in 1944 and 1945. At Saipan, July 7th, 1944, the largest Banzai charge of the Pacific War hit American positions. Over 4,000 Japanese soldiers attacked at dawn. Companies that had incorporated Donnelly-style secondary positions lost an average of 23% casualties. Companies using traditional doctrine lost an average of 41% casualties. At Peleliu, September 1944, Captain Everett Pope's company held a position later called Pope's Ridge, using tactics directly inspired by Donnelly's report. Outnumbered 5-1, Pope positioned his 90 men in overlapping clusters with limited fallback positions. They held for over 14 hours against repeated attacks, suffering 60% casualties but preventing a Japanese breakthrough that would have collapsed the entire American perimeter. But the most dramatic validation came at Iwo Jima, March 1945. On the night of March 8th, a Japanese counterattack hit the 27th Marines' positions. Lieutenant Robert Leader, who'd studied Donnelly's after-action report during training at Camp Pendleton, implemented the same principle. He created intentional gaps in his perimeter, covered by concentrated positions behind the main line. The Japanese attack exploited the gaps, exactly as Leader expected. They pushed through what seemed like weak points, only to find themselves in concentrated crossfire from positions they hadn't anticipated. Leader's company killed an estimated 320 Japanese soldiers, while suffering only 17 killed and 31 wounded. Leader's after-action report specifically cited Donnelly's Bougainville defense as his tactical inspiration. When Marine Corps historians compiled lessons learned from Iwo Jima, Donnelly's name appeared in 17 separate unit reports. The statistical analysis told the story in numbers. Before Donnelly's tactics were disseminated, 1942, early 1944, Marine companies defending against Banzai charges suffered average casualty rates of 37% killed or wounded. After Donnelly's tactics were incorporated, mid-1944-1945, Marine companies using similar defensive principles suffered average casualty rates of 21% killed or wounded. The difference represented approximately 4,200 American lives saved across the final 18 months of the Pacific Campaign. As for the 43 prisoners who fought at Bougainville, their fates varied. 7 had died in the fighting. They were buried with full military honors at the division cemetery, their status as prisoners quietly omitted from the records. The Marines took care of their own, even the ones who'd screwed up. The remaining 36 faced a problem. What do you do with convicted criminals who'd just saved 200 lives? Colonel Masters made the decision. The charges against 29 prisoners were dropped. Their records were annotated with a simple statement: charges dismissed in recognition of exceptional conduct under fire. They returned to regular duty. 7 prisoners, those charged with more serious offenses, including desertion under fire, still faced courts-martial, but their sentences were dramatically reduced. Raymond Kowalski, originally facing 20 years at hard labor for desertion, received 6 months confinement and reduction in rank. He served his sentence, returned to duty, and fought at Guam and Okinawa. He survived the war. Eddie Voss, charged with assault, had all charges dropped. He received a Purple Heart for his wounds at Bougainville and a Bronze Star with V device for valor. He was killed on Iwo Jima, February 23, 1945, during the assault on Mount Suribachi. His name is on the memorial. German intelligence never learned about Donnelly's tactics. They were fighting a different war on different terrain. But Japanese intelligence officers, interrogating captured Marines, did hear stories about American defensive tactics that used trap positions and suicide squads. They couldn't quite understand what they were hearing. The concept of volunteers deliberately accepting positions with no retreat options was compatible with Japanese military philosophy, but incompatible with their understanding of American individualism and self-preservation. One Japanese intelligence report from May 1944, captured after the war, noted, "American defenders are employing new tactics where forward positions appear weak, but secondary positions provide concentrated firepower. This suggests either improved tactical training or acceptance of Japanese-style sacrifice principles. Recommend assuming all American defensive positions may incorporate this approach." They never understood that the tactic had been born of desperation, improvisation, and one captain's willingness to trust 43 criminals to fight like Marines. Captain James Donnelly survived the war. He fought at Guam and Okinawa, always as a company commander, always leading from the front. He never made major. His personnel file contained a letter of reprimand for unauthorized arming of prisoners, alongside a Bronze Star for the same action. The contradictions never got resolved. The Marine Corps simply decided to honor him while officially not approving of what he'd done. He returned to Terre Haute in November 1945. He worked at his father's hardware store. He married a schoolteacher named Dorothy. He never gave interviews about the war. When veterans organizations asked him to speak about Bougainville, he declined politely. In 1968, a Marine Corps historian tracked him down, researching a classified study on improvised defensive tactics. Donnelly, now 52, agreed to one interview. The historian's notes from that conversation survived. Historian: "Did you know your tactics would work when you implemented them?" Donnelly: "No. I knew traditional tactics wouldn't work with the numbers we had, so I tried something different." Historian: "Some critics argue you endangered your command by arming unreliable personnel." Donnelly: "Some critics weren't there. The men I armed saved 200 lives. If that's unreliable, give me unreliable Marines any day." Historian: "What would you say to those prisoners now if you could?" Donnelly: Long pause. "Thank you. You didn't have to fight. You chose to. That's what makes a Marine." Donnelly died in 1987 at age 71. His obituary in the Terre Haute Tribune mentioned his military service in one sentence. It didn't mention Bougainville, didn't mention the prisoners, didn't mention that his improvisation had been quietly incorporated into Marine Corps doctrine and saved thousands of lives. But at Marine Corps University at Quantico, in a tactical studies course taught to every officer candidate, there's a case study simply labeled Defense of Position Tango 7, Bougainville, November 1943. The study doesn't mention prisoners or convicts. It describes the defensive principle in abstract terms. When facing overwhelming force, deliberate concentration of force at secondary positions can create kill zones more effective than even distribution of defenders. Modern Marine infantry officers learn Donnelly's tactic without learning his name. The true legacy isn't in the tactics. It's in what those 43 men proved when given a second chance. The Marine Corps has a saying, "Once a Marine, always a Marine." It's not just about the uniform or the training. It's about the identity that survives even when everything else is stripped away. Those prisoners had been locked up, court-martialed, labeled as failures. But when given rifles and a chance to fight, they proved that the identity remained. They weren't convicts who fought like Marines. They were Marines who'd temporarily forgotten what that meant. Captain Donnelly didn't invent a revolutionary tactic. He simply remembered something the regulations had forgotten. The most important weapon in the Marine Corps arsenal isn't the rifle, isn't the artillery, isn't the aircraft. It's the Marine who refuses to quit, even when he has every reason to. Especially when he has every reason to.